Hi, and welcome to The Mind of a Skeptical Leftist, the podcast where I talk to a variety of people to spread progressive politics, left-wing philosophy, and critical thinking. Today I am joined by Shawn from the Seriously Wrong podcast. And,
thanks for having me.
Yeah, no problem. I'm glad we could connect finally. It's a process sometimes when people are busy.
Oh, yeah, and the pandemic has just made clocks have a totally different character altogether. So I'm glad that we managed to line it up.
So I guess to start off, what is a little bit of your background and what is your political identity, or what brand do you follow?
Cool, yeah. My name's Shawn, and our show Seriously Wrong that we do is like a comedy leftist podcast where we do sort of like sketch comedy interviews and, try to exercise critical thinking and promote good ideas, especially ideas that are like outside of the mainstream where they might sound a little bit weird at first, and then trying to like build the intellectual basis for them. Like broadly politically speaking, I align with, I guess, like social ecology, or the space between anarchism and Marxism, and even a little bit of sort of social democracy sometimes, depending on how it's done. I also identify sort of specifically with this term library socialism, which is a term that we use on the show sometimes to talk about basically the core insight of library socialism. And this comes from social ecology, and I think it connects to pretty much any form of leftism should be able to bring on some of these ideas. But the basic idea is that the library is a space that is non-commodified, and it's a space that shows sort of a map of a way that we could be in society that isn't based on commodities, where there's use rather than ownership. Murray Bookchin, who founded social ecology, he put it like, the environmental crisis is a social crisis. We have these two big issues, which is the overuse of resources in society and the destruction of the environment. But then also resources aren't being distributed to the people who need them. So, capitalism has been good at producing innovations and variations and, creating wealth, as they say. But it's never distributed. It's never, we have the most advanced washing machines that have ever been created, but there's places all over the world where they don't have access to them. So What use is it? So library socialism basically says we got these two big crises, and we already have this thing called the lending library, the public library, that shows a model of how we can address both of these crises at once by producing less things and providing access to more people. So you're able to address the issue of the absence of things that people need, and you can address the issue of the overproduction of the climate crisis in one fell swoop, using sort of like a social mechanical mechanism that we've already tried and tested for generations, called the public library. So that's my elevator pitch, my bumper sticker for library socialism. It's something that I see a lot of people sort of reflecting this also now these days. There's a lot of conversation about what this could mean. So, that's something I'm passionate about. And as you know, I was on your podcast Brainstorm years back. I was the leader of the Pirate Party of Canada briefly when I was a young man of 20, and then later when I was 24, youngest party leader in Canada. I got 188 votes when I ran for office in 2015, which was I kind of regret. I told my friends, it doesn't matter if you vote for me. But I wish I really had like 230. I'd feel a little better about it. But
188 votes is more than anyone else that I know.
Yeah, I and after that, actually, I worked with some social democratic parties, the NDP here in Canada. I was a campaign manager, I was a campaign manager once for the NDP and once for a municipal campaign. So I've got a little bit of experience on that end too, of like, what it takes to run campaigns and stuff like that. It hasn't been all starry-eyed dreaming, but I found that I preferred the starry-eyed dreaming by quite a lot. And so that's sort of politically where I'm coming from. And
I know we're going to talk about epistemology or truth a little bit here, but one of the things that you kind of talk about on your podcast is like a utopian vision, and how utopianism isn't this thing to be made fun of the way that a lot of like cynics really like to make fun of. I wonder if you can like explain where you kind of come from on that a little bit.
Yeah. It's sort of interesting. When I was a young, I can't remember how old I was. I was pretty apolitical, and I remember having this thought like, oh, we have all these problems with society. Like, what's the name for when you make society good? Like, what's the name for, and around I think it was around Occupy. I heard Slavoj Žižek say, you know, we used to call that communism, and it clicked for me. I was like, oh, like communism was about utopia. Oh, like that just makes sense. But then, so I had this sense of like, why don't we use the word utopia? And it wasn't until years and years later that through Aaron, who I do the podcast with, we used to joke around about world peace and stuff. It's another thing that, like, when you hear world peace, you think of like a beauty pageant or something. Like, I wish for world peace, but it's like, who's against world peace? Like, can we make that work?
Why aren't we at least trying?
Yeah, like it's almost like verboten to say the things that we actually know that we need because they sound sort of like too Pollyanna. And that was part of the reason I really like vibed and clicked with social ecology and Murray Bookchin, and specifically Dan Chodakov, who co-founded the Institute for Social Ecology. He wrote this awesome book called The Anthropology of Utopia. And he's articulated a really, really great way of thinking about utopia that clicked with the way that I used to think of it, or that it sort of occurred to me. And he says like that the utopian process is just it's a process in politics that we can either describe it or not, but it's a good thing to describe it. It's a good thing to do it consciously, which is by setting like sort of waypoints in the future, by setting like a waypoint in the future where you can think of like the society that you want to create, then it helps guide what you're doing in the present. And it's not like a permanent blueprint where you're like, this is how it must be. You know, there's a famous example. I think it's actually in Thomas More's Utopia. He believed that every neighborhood should be like pods on a bean, every one of them identical, so you can never get lost. And you know, the ocean should turn to lemonade. And then it turned out that the oceans kind of did turn to lemonade, but in a different way through like acidification. But
except not good.
Yeah. So, and utopia is kind of, I think foundationally it was a pun. So this is sort of my theory on, well, I'll split up what's my theory and what I know for sure. What I know for sure is that utopia it means both, you know, the good place and no place. So there's like e-utopia, which it means the good place, and there's utopia, which means no place. And Thomas More's utopia was sort of like a pun on that, and being like, the perfect is impossible was sort of part of the premise. And it's like a little bit of a self-aware thing. And my sort of interpretation of that is it's almost kind of like how the court jester can say things to the king that other people can't say, kind of thing.
Okay.
So that, and I see that as part of the appeal of utopia too, is like by going a little bit ridiculous and being like, this is how perfect it could be, and describing that and thinking through it like science fiction. You can get a little bit through that ridiculousness. You get a little bit more, you know, metaphorical coverage from the king to really, really subvert the order. And so that's part of what like really draws me to utopia. But broadly speaking, like, yeah, I sort of take I think the more we do science fiction and imaginative sort of thinking about the world that we want to create, the better off we'll be. I mean, there's that famous quote, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. And the reason for that is because there's thousands and thousands, if not millions of dollars put into destroying the imagination of all of us, so we can't imagine an alternative. So if they care so much about preventing us from imagining alternatives, that's a pretty good endorsement for like trying to figure out some alternatives.
For sure.
And library socialism sort of came out of that process too, of like, we were, you know, just trying to boldly describe the way it should be. And, you know, Bookchin used this term usufruct, which is like an anthropological term for types of, pre-capitalist property relationships. So like where where like ownership is basically based on use and you're just sort of like handing it off. And that, you know, like where a group of people, like a good example is like on a work site, you have a collective amount of tools. And if you're like, hey, pass me that hammer, no one's like, all right, $5, I'll pass you that hammer, because you're all doing something together.
It's my hammer.
So I mean, under our system, technically that hammer is owned by someone, and ultimately at the end of the day, they have recourse to like a political authority to prevent people from stealing it or whatever, technically.
Right.
But in like, you know, pre-literate societies and the vast majority of human history, you know, we've lived with sort of usufructian property relationships as a normal thing in our lives. We didn't have this like sort of idea of, oh, this is mine and it belongs to me and there's some sort of psychic connection between me and it. That's what I always think of with property. It's maybe not the most generous interpretation, but this history is something that Bookchin talks about in The Ecology of Freedom. And it really just, it captured my imagination in this way of like, how do you scale up that dynamic to an information, a techno-information society that is, even beyond the dreams of me? Like, how can this dynamic be applied in the real world in ways using technology and connectedness and all these things that we have to create a society that works for everyone? And that was sort of the starting point. And we found, since we started talking to it too, so many people have like written back to us and been like, here's a library socialist take on like food production, or here's a library socialist. And they're like taking some of these ideas and then applying them to their expertise and their specialties. And it's like it's the most awesome thing ever. And then I keep on hearing about like other people, like you see these viral tweets every now and then. It's like 100,000 likes, and someone's like, maybe we should have a society like a library. And it's like, yeah. And it's like, it just keeps on like popping up. It's like people are, I feel like we're just sort of like all figuring it out together. It's like we have this tool right here, and it's like the libraries can completely restructure society, and it like society or libraries provide a map for what society could be like. And you can, I was just thinking the other day, because I read, or it was actually today, I read this article about how libraries, like prison libraries, are an important part of like bringing people out of the prison system and into society, and sort of like getting them ready for a life in society. And that there's a sort of tension between prisons and libraries. There's this fascinating connection between these two things. Like there's even examples of former prisons being turned into libraries. And I'm also a prison abolitionist, in the spirit of Kropotkin, and in the spirit of many others who said, hey, this is kind of crazy to lock people in cages and treat them this poorly. It seems to be, I think Kropotkin called it a nursery of criminality. Right. So libraries help keep it from being a nursery of criminality, and instead of training people to be better criminals, it helps train people to legitimately understand what they've done wrong, if they've done wrong, and then also connect with the outside of society. So I was thinking about this, and like, how many crimes in our society could be solved by having a ultra library beyond our wildest dreams, where say there's a place you can go where if you need something, you can get it, you can borrow it at the very least, whether it's like clothes or shelter or whatever, the things that you need, you can borrow. And like food obviously is not something you can borrow, but I mean, you sort of give it back in a way, but but still, like I consider the dispensing of food as part of the library socialist issue. Right. So how many we know that crime is like a social construct, and disproportionately people are being punished for, their lot in life rather than their actual actions or their morality, right, or lack thereof. But if you set up society where there were like omnipresent, large scale library institutions, where would like theft would become such a small thing? And so like, if you take away the need, theft becomes this sort of like very deliberative act of a very specific type of person. And then even then it's like it's all about this like financial incentive within the system. And it's again about trying to get your needs met. So if people's needs are met, I really think a lot of the things that we see that are wrong with society, or that we consider wrong with society, and the way that people can sort of turn against each other, is caused by lashing out from that absence. And again, libraries provide a model, or at least a framework to think through what an alternative might be like. Because like the library, it's like a book reading program. It's like a program to have more people read books. I feel like if you pitch that in 2020, people are like, how would you get enough books for everyone? What if two people wanted the same book?
We can't do that. That doesn't work. Yeah, no, I've even like, one of my things is one of my jobs is a gig job. I drive for Uber. And I was on a guest on another podcast, and they asked me about, what I do, what I think about how society could work. And I even used like your kind of library socialism theory to be like, okay, if I drive for Uber, and it's something that I enjoy, but what if I don't have to own the car? What if it's a car that, I just pick up and then I drive people around for the day, and that's my duty for the day, that's my contribution to the society that we're in. I don't have to get paid for it if my needs are met, and I don't have to own the car if it's society's car, if we all kind of care for it in a sense. I mean, I didn't really flesh it out 100%, but it was kind of like, okay, I enjoy driving people around. I can contribute to society this way, but it also, we would probably have better public transit too, but.
On that note, actually, I've thought about this before, the public transit and Uber thing. I've got this, just a wild idea, so I don't, maybe you can think about it further when you're on the road or whatever, maybe someone in the audience. But I feel like it makes a lot of sense to integrate things like the Uber driving economy, or like the sort of like swarm economy around transportation, to integrate it more consciously with public transit systems, and to consider them part of one system that fill the gaps in each other's needs. And if you could set up a system where like people can hop on as basically, you know, transit drivers, and, you know, I think some of these apps already do this where you have multiple people picked up on one trip and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But you could really, you know, if we wanted to, and if there was the money in it, but because this is a political, I'm proposing something political, so it would need to be done by like committees and institutions, and it has to be recommended by so and so and so and so, and like, and actually we'll do it after the second re-election and all that. But if it was done, and you know, it's going to cost money to set up, so oh my God, they're raising our taxes for the it's a fun game figuring out like public policy. But I think if you integrate them, you can really have them play to each other's strengths and weaknesses in a way that, you know, prevents drivers from being exploited, continues and maintains the user experience that people like. Because we sort of take I guess a heterodox position on our show that we're in favor of good user experiences. Like when people, you know, like what makes these institutions powerful is the way that they're convenient and the way that they're, that people get used to using them. So I think an important thing that we should do on the left when we're creating our utopia is try to keep the parts that people really like while getting rid of all the things that make us feel sick to our stomach. And I think it's totally possible with something like the gig economy. Again, if people's needs are met, you know, people aren't being exploited. And I think it makes sense with transport to integrate it into a public transit system. You know, you could have it so like your bus pass has credit that can be used on taxis and vice versa and stuff, like treat transportation as one public good, and make sure that when we're making public transit decisions, or we're making transit decisions as a region, we're considering all the different types of transit that people take and how, you know, different levels of convenience and stuff like that. I think there's a richer conversation to have if we consider both of these as part of the same ecosystem.
For sure. Yeah. Like you say, like the drivers in the vehicles could be in areas where bus routes maybe don't work, or, you know, after certain hours. I mean, in a lot of ways, Uber or taxis already do this, right? If buses don't run after 9 p.m. on a Saturday, well, the workers in that area who work till 11, they still have to get transport somehow. So, but now it's expensive, and it comes out of their paycheck, so it comes out of their other bills, and plus the drivers, like you say, are exploited, so the profit goes up to somebody else, and in order to make a living doing Uber, you have to drive 16 hours a day. So it's similar. You could run it similar to what we have now, just do it intentionally, like you say, and instead of without the exploitation.
Yeah, and again, just another weird little technical policy idea. I don't know if this would work, but it just occurred to me, is like, you know how they have like the surge pricing and that sort of stuff? You could set up sort of like a inverse surge pricing thing where you incentivize people going to areas that don't have transit service, and make it more expensive for you to call an Uber if you're right by a bus stop. Like you actually ride the bus as far as it goes, and then switch to the Uber, and you'll get a better deal, kind of thing. Right. To like incentivize those climate pathways. But I don't know. Just thinking out loud about how these things could, like,
for sure.
I think there's we get really caught up in like these divisions of like, I think from a public policy perspective, people think of these as very, very distinct things, and rightfully so, because of the labor conditions and stuff like that. And compared to buses, are often unionized, public, good socialist proletarian buses versus,
right.
But
versus the pseudo-capitalist Uber driver.
Yeah, well, the aristocratic Uber managers and the Uber serfs,
right.
Getting their masks pulled off by lunatics and whatnot.
Yeah.
But on that subject, getting your mask pulled off by a lunatic, it's that's something I wanted to talk to you about. And you got your shows about leftism and skepticism, and I remember the sort of the political developments of the last however many years, as we had this like sort of skeptic movement, and maybe you could talk a little more about this. We had the skeptic movement that had a really big fracture around the time of when we're dealing with first I guess sort of the Iraq War, and then moving into stuff like Gamergate and feminism and stuff like. And there was this real sort of fracture, and I considered myself part of the skeptic community as well. But I saw this and it was probably around 2014, 2015 when it really started getting very intense. Although there'd always been that sort of like, Chris Hitchens supported the war in Iraq or whatever. Yeah,
which nobody really enjoyed that part of it. At least nobody I was involved with. But
yeah. So I'm curious about how you... In your experience I know you've been podcasting over this time too, like how that bifurcation where you have the sort of, a lot of, I guess, former left skeptics are maybe lowercase s skeptics now, as they focus on the left or something like that because of that association. But I think it's also really important, obviously, to have that rigor and make sure that we're not just, as Carl Sagan says, if you fall for a charlatan, you often get invested in what the charlatan's trying to sell you so much that no one can convince you otherwise. And I think that remains true today.
We're so hardcore into that. Society is right in that right now.
Yeah. We're seeing it really, really, the danger. Like, Carl Sagan was right about that. He was like, we're heading towards a potential era of darkness where charlatans lead the day, and people's investment in charlatans make them unwilling to hear reason and facts. And it definitely seems to be where we're at.
Yeah, I mean, like you say, like in 2016, I still felt there was like a movement, even though you could feel that rift happening. And then like right around that time, I did a series of podcast interviews where I discussed social justice with people who were pro-social justice or who would have been labeled social justice warriors. And I did, and with people who were anti-social justice warriors. And both, like, almost entirely out of the atheist and skeptic community. And one thing that kept popping up was like, if we do not figure out how to navigate this, then the skeptical community is done. The atheist community is done. And then YouTube skepticism, like, it really caught a huge surge for a little bit there. And it seemed to be like anybody who wasn't, then you really had to pick a side. It was, you were on board with social justice, and that means that you believed in systemic racism, and you believed in patriarchy, and or rather you accepted the evidence of these things, or you denied them and became like the social justice version of a science denier, or a climate change denier, or anti-vaxxer. And a lot of our skeptical community was apparently just so invested in being smarter than other people that they could not accept that they were wrong on certain things.
Right.
And I mean, I remember feeling like that superiority, that I'm smarter than everybody kind of feeling, until I started exploring these subjects in depth. And then I was like realizing, like, okay, well, I better accept how little I know, because there's all these people who have this experience that I know I don't have, explaining things to me that I know I've never seen. Well, I mean, you can maybe apply that same logic to like something supernatural per se, but then there's also like research done on various social issues, and like there's papers with evidence, and it's not just an anecdotal, I saw a ghost. It's, no, racism exists, and here's the evidence for it. So I don't know. It's still hard though. Separating fact from fiction and knowing what's true, and like Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if that got to what you were getting at, but
No, totally. I'm fascinated too for like your perspective on this, because I'd seen I guess like I guess fairly early on I'd been convinced of some issues related to, say, like in particular sexism and then racism, in that order, I'm embarrassed to say, but I had to be convinced of the severity of these things. And the you know, as a young person, I'd been raised in this very like colorblind and gender blind society. And I remember it really being sort of a unpleasant, you know, an unpleasant, can I swear?
yeah, oh yeah.
An unpleasant mindfuck when I realized that I had been misogynistic for as long as I could remember in my actions. And that, like, upon reflection, the way that we talked in groups as a child was kind of disturbing to think about some of the details of what passed in the elementary school or in the high school. So I get the desire to hold on against that. But people who made it past the Trump election still holding on to it are a certain type, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing. Like, during that first bit, when Trump was first elected, and you had like this rift was, I mean, it was still there. There was a lot of people discussing these things, and I lost a lot of friends the more and more I accepted the evidence for like systemic racism and patriarchy and like these things. And it was, I mean, everybody stopped at a certain point, right? Like you could say, okay, well, I accept the evidence for, you know, sexism in this case, but it's not a big deal over the whole thing. There's no such thing as rape culture, stuff like that. Like you could accept one case of sexism, but microaggressions are bullshit, you know, stuff like that. Like everybody had their line where they stopped, except for, well, I mean, not everybody, obviously, but, and some people just kept going and going and going. And then you find, like we found on the left, atheist, left skeptic communities, that the people who stayed behind and stayed in those more right-wing perspectives were suddenly using like those same kind of like arguments that we used to hear from conservatives all the time that were anti-LGBT. It was all this dishonest like framing of things where, oh, well, if we, I guess it's veiled like great replacement theory stuff. Is what it ends up coming down to. Yeah, it's bizarre.
No, yeah, and it is troubling in as a young person identifying with people in sort of a peer group like that, and then reaching that rupture point where you see, like, first of all, you have to sort of address in yourself, hey, maybe I don't know everything. Maybe there is good times for me to listen and not talk, and maybe there is good times to take seriously other people's like descriptions of harm that have been done to them, because it's like that. And I think for in the atheist sort of skeptic community, that was it was sort of a point of pride in like the early 2000s atheist sort of skeptic community, that to I guess be emphasizing all the harm that actually wasn't being done. So it's sort of like there's an early proto trigger culture in like triggering Christians because it's so innocuous, and that was sort of, there's space for different people to all get together around sort of like trolling Christians for different reasons. But then when you start applying it to like people who are you know, disadvantaged or suffering, talking about some way that they've been unfairly treated, and then taking the same tactic against them, it becomes this very twisted thing. Well, on this broad subject, the thing, I in 2021, I was like, on New Year's, I was like, okay, this has been 1 year like this, and I'm just going to be really pessimistic and assume there's going to be another 2 like this. Like, how do I make a better use of, how do I take a better grasp of this moment? And I found myself thinking more and more about the reality bifurcation issue, the anti-maskers, the anti-COVID, the election fraud in the United States, allegations from like the Trump supporters and all this. And it seemed to me this was going on all through 2020. And I saw people I knew who were, I wouldn't say they were well-grounded before this, but they're certainly in a totally different place now in a bad way as a result of all the isolation, the COVID stuff, the Trump stuff, all this sort of stuff. And in 2021, I was kind of like, I need to wrap my head around this reality bifurcation thing and like how truth works and like what like how I need to be able to articulate this better, and so that's been, I guess, one of my intellectual fixations this year, which is another reason I was really excited to talk to you, because I was curious to hear your thoughts or experiences on the COVID isolation guy who was already sort of a conspiracy theorist becoming like, I'm not sure if you know anyone like this, but I know of two or three off the top of my head who I could say are sort of in that category. COVID really just pushed them in a different direction for the worse. And I've become more and more concerned about the religious nature of these convictions.
Yeah. I'm not, as much as I've tried to come up with a good insight into this, I don't really have a great insight. I know, like, I mean, we're all alienated, right? We're all isolated, and we've been told that we're supposed to stand up on our own, but now we're in a situation where we have to rely on everybody around us doing something. And I think you combine that with this idea that, like, because we've also all been fed like hero narratives through our media for so long too, that if, like, the QAnon thing, it came along at a time where people were feeling all of these feelings, and it told them, you're a hero. All you have to do is be part of this group, and you're saving children, or you're saving the world. And of course, I mean, you add, like, they had to be pro-Trump in there, but somehow even though it attached to Trump, it somehow appealed to people who were previously anti-Trump through this alienation combined with a hero narrative, right? And I don't have a good solution by any stretch. It's really a tough problem to solve. I mean, I jokingly say to many people when they ask me, no, we're just fucked. Like, we just don't live in the same world, and there's no way to reconcile it. But if I truly believed that, I would quit doing anything. So I do somewhere in my head think that there is a way to reconcile this. It's just, we have to find that inroad. There's something there that we have to find to appeal to people that's based on reality. Like, I don't know, what about reality do you find appealing? What do you find appealing about, living within the most evidence-based world that you can live in? And that,
Yeah, there is a way to, because part of the appeal of the conspiracy theory is getting to be the special boy who's, sees behind the curtain. And I wonder if, there was a guy that I was arguing online with in like a Facebook group, sort of a friend of a friend thing. And a mutual friend of ours was like, you just have to sort of recognize this guy's just kind of narcissistic. He's never going to be able to read anything that contradicts him and hear it. But I was like, I had this little, maybe naive hope where I'm like, okay, maybe he is really self-centered and all of his posts are about looking in a metaphorical mirror about how much he's got it figured out. But where's that really like coming from in society? He doesn't have any political voice. So like his best political voice is to choose between Biden and Trump. So it really makes sense. About half the time people are going to pick, one of them, so maybe it's not so horrifying and crazy that people that we know in left-wing cities like Wooks or whatever are voting for Trump. Maybe it's not that freaky. Maybe it's just like, oh, you gave him two options and, second option bias, and low information voters are like, the second guy, Biden, I heard this bad thing about from this other guy. And,
I mean, I don't want to like imagine it as like, this is, education is what's going to solve it though. Right. Like, I don't think that it's necessarily, about giving them the information. I think we have to like actually give them hope, give people some reason to believe in what's true, and give them something to look forward to in society. Like, that's actually part of why I like the utopian vision of your show, because, and that's part of why I'm an anarcho-communist, or, I identify that way, because I believe in, I came to this vision of a better world that needs to be possible. And I think, as villainized as communism and anarchism are, I think that some way of framing that as a future for society and as for individuals with flourishing lives, I really think that that's the best way we can go forward. and connect with people.
Right. Yeah. The sort of how we treat people in those situations. It's hard to make a general like we should across society type thing, but when it comes to like people in our own families or communities, I think there is a lot of benefit of the doubt we can give people who fall far off the path in terms of, especially on that personal level. I mean, like, I'm not talking about, like it's all of our job to be like a soul saver going around and saving people from, delusional thinking or something like that through
the more of those
comment
there
section.
are, the better.
Sure. And if you're good at it, please share your tips.
Yeah.
But when it comes to like people in our lives, I think there's a lot of room for just keeping that loving space open where when they have those doubts, that they know that you're not against them and that they can talk to you and that they can sort of think through the questions that they have and where sometimes you can almost, I know like for people I know who I've seen really change their perspective on some of these big issues we're talking about, like, patriarchy, institutional racism, the transatlantic slave trade and all this sort of stuff, that when you have like a good historical basis, you're like, okay, I get why people are so upset about this stuff and it's important. Like in the times where I've seen people make good progress on that, sometimes it's been through sort of the early guise of a thought experiment of just like thinking through the other side and thinking about how it's internally consistent and thinking about sort of where they're coming from. And you can sort of approach it from, with the right person at least, that sort of like steel manning perspective of like, if you really want to argue against the SJWs, you should know their arguments better than they do. And if you try to do it with social justice, like now you're on the team, because it's just like the other side is much worse arguments, honestly.
Yeah, that's right.
But yeah, when I think of utopia, for the utopian response to the dystopian reality bifurcation of the 2020 sphere, I've got some beginnings of ideas, although I'm still actively in the process, I would say.
Right.
I don't have any big golden gem I can show, but gems are never gold, actually, come to think of it. Gem and gold are different things. But
gold nugget, sure.
But one thing is like the process of science. I think there's some really good critiques about the way that resources are distributed and the way that replication doesn't always happen and the way that, I've read very detailed critiques of this kind of stuff that I can't relay off the top of my head, but there is a real case to make that there's problems with the institutions of truth as they currently exist and that they're at the very least sort of, disproportionately walled off. Science isn't a public affair. It's not something you can just walk up off the street and be like, hey, I got an idea for an experiment, guys. Our scientific community doesn't work that way. And it seems to me that it would be ideal to try to bridge the gap between a very institutionalized and dare I say, like aristocratic finance-based sphere of science where, funding is coming for people wanting to develop products and stuff like that, or limited funding in universities or different contexts, but not enough money to go around for all of the experimentation that would naturally go on if we really just, unlock the gate and said, hey, humanity, do as much science as you want. Everyone can be involved. We're going to train you up. We're going to get you involved in different processes. We're going to start you off on small things that aren't dangerous, as part of group things. But if you want to be involved, you can. That process could teach us to a higher level. And I feel like I've got an okay idea about this as an outsider, but most people don't, which is the process of the feeling out of the possibilities that science is really a great part about, is considering what the possible options could be and then figuring out ways to test which of those options is more likely, and then finding ways to look at experiments other people have done and said, is there an issue with this? Is there a way that we can reframe this? Yeah. Or ask slightly different questions to see if we're really measuring what we think we're measuring. I feel like if everyone could be involved in that process in a higher degree, and I don't know the exact way to do it, it would be a lot harder for people to have the wrong types of conspiracy theories about science and institutions of science. It'd be a lot harder for people to think, oh, this is all some big pharma conspiracy. The entirety of all medical research is just inherently a lie because it's done by politicians or something.
It's like it's like on some level, people who participated in the vaccine trials, right? Like once they were in that vaccine trial, it was like, okay, well, not only did they learn about the vaccine more, but then they're more... Where can people find you?
Yeah, so seriouslywrong.com, that's SRSLY wrong.com. Our podcast Seriously Wrong is also on like iTunes and Stitcher, any place where you can get podcasts, on YouTube as well. And later this year in fall, probably, we haven't got a release date yet, but I'll also have a new cartoon show on Means TV, the anti-capitalist streaming service. So later this year, I'm really excited to share. I've been working on it for about a year now. And it is, crazy cartoon adventures for an anti-capitalist audience, family friendly, awesome. Some episodes PG, mostly G. So I'm excited to share that. Yeah. And, the Seriously Wrong is what we do most of the time.
And it's a great show. Like, I've been listening pretty avidly for, I don't know, a while now, ever since it was introduced to me by, a friend of my old show, Jesse Hoffner. He tagged you on a tweet and he said, "Hey, here's a podcast you might like." And I was like, "Hey."
Awesome. Well, yeah, I'm really glad to hear it. And yeah, it's cool to hear that because yeah, our paths crossed in an earlier life, where I was sort of like a politician, talking to you one time,
right?
And sort of riffing about sort of similar ideas. And then you also caught me on the next orbit with the podcast. That's really neat.
And I guess at the time I still identified with anarchism at the time, but more of a like centrist capitalist anarchism. And, I prefer the anarchism I have now. So,
right. Well, my co-host Aaron is also really in a similar, category of coming into, through skepticism, anarchism. And then he had a little bit of a utopian thing because he also connected with the Zeitgeist movement when that was a big thing.
Oh yeah.
So he really liked that sort of like vision of an alternate society they put forward. But yeah, he similarly came from this sort of like centrist anarchist. Well, maybe, and early in our show, we did that same sort of thing you mentioned of like trying to find like, the both sides, like let's feel it out kind of thing. And,
right.
But then he had the same process, I think, that a lot of us did over the last, 5-6 years of just the strength of the evidence and the not just the evidence, but also like the ethical pull of knowing, of feeling like the evidence backs the ethical pull and the ethical feeling like a lot disproportionately, even sometimes better than you might guess, from the outside. Like there's a lot of evidence for a lot of these things. But ultimately I think we're driven to this stuff because we, it feels too dirty to be apart from it. It just feels too wrong to not be a part of trying to make the world a better place like that. Once you see it, it's just hard to be like, oh, never mind. I'm just really gonna.
It's fine. Somebody will take care of it.
Yeah.
No, awesome. Well, thank you for joining me.